She recalibrated it wrong, Commander Vithai said, not even looking up from the drift tolerance summary glowing on his display. Pull her off the line. Lieutenant Orlin hesitated at the threshold of the calibration annex. Through the viewport, the human woman was visible Dara Kass, age 31, junior alignment technician, third shift, crouched beneath the navigational pylon of the frigate Ascending Veil, with a hand-drooled reference slate balanced on her knee and a battered multi-point caliper in her left hand. Her lips were moving silently, running numbers the way some people run rosaries, thumb over each bead. "Sir," Orlin began, "the variance was within." "Within nothing." Vithais flicked the display closed with 2 fingers. Pylon 9 drifted 6 arcseconds after her last pass. The ascendancy does not abide 6 arcseconds. Remove her from the rotation. File a performance note. Orlin started to speak again, then stopped. He had been stationed on Ethira's cradle long enough to know when Commander Vithais was issuing an order and when he was opening a discussion. This was an order. He nodded once and left. The comms panel in the calibration bay had been open. Dara had heard every word. The vowels of the commander's Veilori accent were clipped and certain, and they carried through the steel-walled bay the way subsonic vibration carries through a ship's hull, not loud, but everywhere, impossible to ignore. She set her caliper down. She wiped her hands on the gray cloth she kept folded in her hip pocket, the same cloth she had carried since her first assignment on the Terran Cooperative's Deep Survey vessel Bridger, where she had spent 4 years calibrating navigational arrays at the edge of mapped space. She signed her name off the duty roster, collected her meal chit from the dispenser, and ate alone in the refectory alcove reserved for maintenance auxiliaries, the table nearest the air recycling vent, the one with the persistent draft, the one nobody else wanted. That was 63 days ago, 63 days of mopping. The Veilori Ascendancy's credentialing authority did not recognize Terran cooperative certifications. Dara had known this when she applied. It was printed on the immigration advisory, line 47, in small type. She had applied anyway, because the Bridger survey contract had ended and the next Terran posting was 18 months out, and she had rent and a caliper and 4 years of navigational data that proved she was the best alignment specialist the cooperative had fielded in a decade. None of that data translated. The Ascendancy's credentialing matrix had no column for Terran Deep Survey calibration. It had a column for unskilled maintenance labor, and that was where she went. 63 days of mopping Deck 14's corridors, the residential wing, where Veilori officers lived with their families, where the air smelled faintly of the ion-neutral fragrance the Ascendancy pumped through its climate system, where the flooring was a pale composite that showed every scuff mark and every water trail. She mopped in a pattern she had optimized by the second week. Start at the far junction, work inward, 12-minute segments per corridor section, bucket refill at the maintenance alcove on frame 47, and a 4-minute overlap at the nursery corridor where Deck 14 met the residential security perimeter. She had learned the rhythm of the deck. She knew that Commander Vithais walked the corridor at 7:30 and again at 1900, his boot falls even and unhurried, always on the left side. She knew that physician Ulith carried a stylus that clicked against his belt clip every 4th step. She knew that the nannies changed shifts at uneven intervals, 47 minutes between Saratai's departure and Tessith's arrival, because Tessith stopped at the refectory for a cup of Eshel tea, and no one had thought to adjust the schedule to account for it. She knew these things because noticing was what she did. On the Bridger, noticing was the job. A 1/16th of a degree misalignment in a navigational array could compound over 100 light-year transit into a course error of 4 million kilometers. You noticed, or ships went to the wrong star. The Ascendancy had taken the noticing and redirected it at floor stains, but the noticing itself did not stop. It could not stop. It was the way Dara's mind worked, the way Talvin's mind worked, the way any mind worked that was tuned to frequencies most people filtered out. Now Dara was mopping a corridor on deck 14 of the Velori Palace Station, Ithira's cradle, and she was not supposed to be listening to anything at all. But the crying had been going on for 11 hours. She paused with the mop handle resting against her collarbone, the worn rubber grip warm from her palm. The sound came through the sealed nursery door in thin, exhausted waves, a child's voice, raw and hiccuping, stripped past fury and grief to some terrain beyond both. It was the sound of a child who had forgotten the original cause and could not find the exit from the effect. Anyone who had worked long shifts on small vessels knew the sound in a different register. The alarm that has been ringing so long the crew no longer hears it, but the vibration is eating the weld seams. She had heard other voices through that door all morning. Nanny Saratai at the first hour, her alto calm and practiced, the kind of voice that worked on most Velori children. By the third hour, calm had curdled into brittleness. Physician Ulith arrived at the fourth hour, clipped and diagnostic, issuing instructions to someone Dara could not see. A second physician at the fifth, a third at the sixth, bringing equipment. Dara heard the hum of a biometric scanner through the door, followed by a murmured consultation that resolved nothing. A protocol officer at the seventh hour, whose title Dara did not know, speaking in the formal register reserved for matters involving the Ascendancy's direct bloodline. Then Commander Vithais himself, his voice low and hard, ordering the child to compose himself the way one might order a failing coolant loop to regulate. None of it had worked. Each new voice entering the room was another frequency layered onto the chaos, another adult performing competence in a space that did not need competence, it needed quiet. At the eighth hour, Dara heard a sound she recognized from her own history, the silence of people leaving a room they cannot fix, one at a time, until the room is empty again. First, the protocol officers measured footsteps. Then the physicians, murmuring to each other about follow-up assessments. Then Vithais, his boots heavy on the decking, a door closing with more force than necessary. Now, at the 11th hour, the corridor was deserted. Nanny Saratai's replacement, a young Velori woman named Tessith, had gone in and come out 14 minutes later with streaks of pale bioluminescent tears on her cheeks. She had walked past Dara's mop bucket without seeing her, because nobody saw the mopping auxiliary. That was the entire function of the job. You pushed the mop, you emptied the bucket, you refilled the solution canister, and you were invisible. Dara had been invisible for 63 days, and before that she had been invisible for 4 years on the Bridger, where her calibrations kept the ship on course, and nobody remembered her name until the course drifted. The child was Prince Talvin, age 4, second heir to the Velori ascendancy. Dara knew this the way she knew most things aboard Ithira's cradle, by keeping her head down and her ears open. In 63 days of mopping Deck 14's corridors, she had assembled a detailed map of the prince's world without ever entering it. She knew he had not spoken a full sentence in 6 months. 3 developmental specialists from the Ascendancy's Central Institute for Child Cognition had filed assessments, each one longer and less conclusive than the last. The first specialist had recommended sensory enrichment activities. The second had recommended reduced stimulation. The third had recommended a full neurological workup at the Institute's core facility, which would have required relocating the prince off station for 3 weeks, a recommendation the Empress had declined without explanation, though the tight set of her jaw when Dara glimpsed her in the corridor afterward suggested the explanation was grief, not indifference. Dara knew the nursery staff rotated on 6-day cycles, because none of them lasted longer. She knew that staff turnover was treated as a scheduling problem rather than a diagnostic clue. She knew that every nanny who left filed the same 2-sentence summary. The prince remains non-responsive. Standard protocols ineffective. And she knew, from mopping the corridor within earshot 209 times, that standard protocols meant talking louder, talking brighter, talking more the exact opposite of what any sensory-sensitive child needed. She also knew that the prince's crying episodes followed a structure nobody else had mapped. They spiked when the ambient lighting shifted from the nursery's default, warm white to the cooler blue of the station's general illumination cycle. The shift happened every 90 minutes, part of the Villori circadian regulation system, timed to adult physiology. They worsened when the ventilation system cycled to its hourly high-exchange mode, which pushed the atmospheric processors to peak throughput and produced, as a byproduct, a subsonic hum at roughly 18 Hz, below the threshold of adult Villori hearing, below the threshold of most adult human hearing, not below the threshold of a small child sitting alone in a room with hard walls that reflected low frequencies. And the episodes correlated with the 47-minute gap between nanny shift changes, when the nursery was technically staffed but emotionally vacant, one person leaving and another arriving, neither fully present. Dara had written these numbers in the margin of her reference slate. She had not told anyone. There was no mechanism for a mopping auxiliary to submit observations about a royal child. She had noted the data and kept mopping. But 11 hours was a structural failure, not a behavioral event. 11 hours meant the supports had given way. She set the mop in its bucket. She dried her hands on the gray cloth. She pressed the nursery door's entry panel. It opened. The nursery was dim, cooler blue from the general illumination cycle, exactly as her data predicted. The hum was present, low and pervasive. The room was large, ceilinged high enough that footsteps vanished upward. A slow-shifting mural covered the vaulted ceiling, the ascendancies founding constellations in phosphorescent paint, soft furnishings in pale violet and silver, a child-scaled sleeping platform with translucent canopy drapes, toys on low shelves with the too neat precision of things arranged by adults. In the center of the room, on the bare floor, sat Prince Talvin. He was small even for a Villori 4-year-old, fine-boned, pale lavender skin traced along his temples by faint silvery bioluminescent lines. His hair was white-silver, damp and disordered. His eyes, when he looked up, were enormous pale violet irises ringed with a faint cyan glow dimmed by exhaustion. His nose was running. His mouth was swollen. He wore a sleep tunic embroidered with small silver stars, and he was holding a broken wing from a mechanical bird in both hands, gripping it the way a child grips the one thing left when everything else has gone wrong. Dara stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. She assessed. She did not crouch. She did not put on a warm voice. She did not perform the half-bow that protocol required. She had noticed, over 209 moppings, that every adult who entered this room started with a performance: the bow, the bright voice, the manufactured warmth, and the child flinched from it every time. Performances were noise. She walked to a spot 6 feet from where the prince sat, lowered herself to the floor, and folded her legs beneath her. The floor was cool through the fabric of her uniform trousers. The hum was louder at floor level. She could feel it in her sternum, a faint vibration that an adult standing upright would never register. Down here, at a child's height, the room was a different place. The light hit differently. The hum sat differently. The ceiling mural loomed larger, and the toys on the shelves were at eye level. And Dara understood, with the immediate clarity of someone who had just changed her vantage point, why a child who lived at this altitude would hear and see and feel things that no adult walking through the room would notice. "That looks broken," she said, in the same flat, quiet voice she used when talking to herself during alignment checks. Observation offered at room temperature. Talvin stared. The crying paused, not stopped, paused. His chest hitched. His lower lip trembled. Dara pulled out the caliper, turned it in her hands, and waited. "I fix things," she said. "That is what I do. May I see it?" 10 seconds. Then he held out the broken wing. She examined it, a miniature pivot mechanism on a jewel bearing no larger than a grain of rice. The pivot pin had sheared from repetitive stress, opened and closed hundreds of times by a child using it as a soothing mechanism. Same failure mode she had seen in the ascending veil's gimbal housings. Same fix: redistribute the load. She tore a thin strip from her gray cloth, packed the joint, and used the caliper's jaw to crimp the housing back into alignment in 3 precise increments. 90 seconds. The wing clicked into place with a clean sound. "There," she said, and held it out. Talvin took it, opened, closed, opened again, listening. The joint held, his breathing steadied, his eyes locked on the wing with the absorption of someone watching a repair hold. Dara set the caliper on her knee and waited. 2 minutes, then it was making a sound. His voice was small, hoarse. 3 specialists had filed him as nonverbal trending. He had not spoken in 6 months. Dara kept her face still. "What kind of sound?" "A wrong sound, this part, when it broke. It made a sound that was wrong, and then everything was wrong." She watched how he held the wing, always with both hands, hinge facing inward, opening it partway and listening. Not playing, analyzing. She understood. The nursery's 18 hertz hum, the lighting shifts, the staffing gap, the broken hinge producing a frequency that, to a child calibrated to sounds most adults never registered, was the last weight on a bridge already bowing. Everything was wrong because everything had been producing wrong sounds, and no one heard it because no one was listening at his frequency. "I know about wrong sounds," Dara said. "There are some in this room right now. Do you want me to fix those too?" Talvin searched her face, then he nodded. Dara stood, walked to the environmental panel, and shifted the lighting back to warm white. She accessed the ventilation subroutine and reduced the high exchange cycle by 40%. The hum dropped below perception. The room changed in ways an adult would not have noticed. But Talvin's shoulders dropped half an inch, and the tension left his eyes, and she knew. She sat back down, better. He opened the wing 3 times, shuffled 2 feet closer, placed the wing on the floor between them. "What is your name?" "Dara." "Dara, you smell like the clean floors thing." "I mop, that is my job now." "What was your job before?" "I fix things pointed at the stars." "Why did you stop?" "Someone said I did it wrong." "Did you?" "No." He held out the wing. "Fix more things." Dara took it, pretended to inspect it, and fixed it again with an extra wrap. She handed it back. Talvin smiled, small, uncertain, real. The cyan ring around his irises brightened. "Stay," he said. "I should not be here." "Stay." He placed one hand on the floor near her knee, not touching, close. Dara stayed. Over the next hour, she fixed everything he showed her. The crystalline building set 2 missing pieces behind the sleeping platform, a third fabricated from cloth and a caliper screw. The star map projector misaligned lens, corrected 1/16th turn counterclockwise. The plush 6-legged creature, asymmetrical stitching on the 3rd left leg, resewn with thread from her uniform hem. With each repair, he moved closer. By the hour's end, he was within arm's reach, and his fingers brushed hers when she handed back the creature. "The other people talk loud," he said. "They say, Talvin, look at me. Talvin, use your words. Their voices are in the wrong place." "Where?" "Up here," he pointed above his head. "They talk over me, you talk from here." He pointed at the floor, "from the same place. Do you want me to come back tomorrow?" "Yes, I will open the door." And then, with grave 4-year-old deliberation, "You can fix everything." That night, in the quarters she shared with 3 other auxiliary workers on Deck 22, a windowless room with stacked berths, and a ventilation outlet that produced its own subsonic hum. Though Dara had learned to sleep through it, she lay in the dark and turned the caliper over in her hands and thought about what she had done. She had entered a royal nursery without authorization. She had altered restricted environmental controls. She had spoken to a prince without protocol clearance. Any one of these was a dismissal offense. Together, they were grounds for deportation removal from Ithira's cradle and return to the Terran Cooperative's labor pool, where she would wait 18 months for a posting that might or might not recognize her qualifications. She had also in 90 minutes accomplished what 3 developmental specialists, 7 nannies, and a commander had not. She had gotten a child who had been silent for 6 months to speak. Not with therapy, not with protocol, with a caliper, a strip of cloth, and the decision to sit on the floor and talk at room temperature. She did not know whether she would go back. She told herself she would not. She was a mopping auxiliary. The nursery was not her domain. The prince was not her responsibility. She had overstepped, and the smart thing, the survivable thing, was to mop her corridor and forget the sound of a 4-year-old saying, "Fix more things," in a voice that had been silent half a year. By morning, she had decided to go back. She came back the next day, and the next, and the day after that. She adjusted her mopping schedule to create a 40-minute window during Talvin's worst period, the ventilation cycle spike that no one else had connected to his distress, and she slipped through the nursery door each time with her bucket parked in the corridor and the caliper in her pocket. She did not tell anyone. She did not file a request. She simply shifted her corridor rotation by 12 minutes, which placed her outside the nursery at the right moment, and she walked in. Day 2, the wing refailed. The fiber wrap had loosened overnight under the prince's persistent testing. He had opened and closed the hinge more than 300 times, by Dara's estimate based on the wear pattern. She reinforced the joint with a double wrap and a tiny splint fashioned from a spare caliper screw, crimped tight with the adjustable jaw. This time she showed him how the splint worked, why it held where the stress went. He listened with the focus of an engineering student, not a patient. He asked 2 questions. Why does it break at the same place? And can you make the place stronger? Both questions were structurally sound, and she answered them the same way she would have answered a colleague. Day 3. A seam in the translucent canopy drape above his sleeping platform. The stitching was crooked by approximately 4 degrees, enough to throw a thin shadow at an angle across his pillow when the nursery was in warm white mode. Talvin had not complained about it directly. Dara noticed the seam herself, the way she noticed every line in a room that was slightly off-true, and when she asked if the shadow bothered him, he was quiet for a long time before answering. "It is the loudest thing in the dark," he said. Dara restitched the seam with thread pulled from the hem of her uniform. The shadow disappeared. That night, according to the nursery's automated wellness log, which Dara had figured out how to access through the environmental panel, because maintenance codes shared a route with monitoring codes, Talvin slept for 6 consecutive hours, the longest uninterrupted sleep period the system had recorded in 4 months. Day 4. A squeaking wheel on a small toy transport vehicle, one of a set of 3 that Talvin kept arranged in a precise line on the lowest shelf. 2 of the 3 rolled silently. The third produced a high-frequency squeak on every rotation. Talvin described the sound as like teeth, which Dara interpreted as a frequency in the 2000 to 4000 Hz range, the band where Valori hearing was most acute. She disassembled the wheel housing, found a manufacturing burr on the axle where the stamping process had left a tiny ridge of excess alloy, smoothed it flat with the caliper's edge, and reassembled the mechanism in silence while Talvin watched. He spoke a full paragraph that day, the longest sustained speech anyone had recorded from him in 6 months. He described the founding constellations in the ceiling mural, naming each one in Valori formal register, and explained with careful, step-by-step precision why 2 of them were painted in the wrong position relative to each other. The mural artist had used an outdated star chart that predated the Ascendancy's last astrometric survey by 11 years, and the resulting positional error was approximately 1.3 degrees of arc. Dara checked against her reference slate that evening. He was correct. The error was 1.4 degrees. He had been off by 1/10. Day 5. The star map projector. Its primary lens element had slipped under thermal cycling, throwing the nursery's projected constellations slightly off-true on the curved wall. Dara corrected the alignment with the caliper's edge, rotating the lens housing 1/16 of a turn counterclockwise. Talvin watched the projected stars shift into their correct positions, and his expression changed in a way that Dara could only describe as physical relief. The look of someone who has been seeing the world slightly crooked for so long they forgot what straight looked like, and just remembered. She fixed the projector twice more over the following days, because the lens housing had a manufacturing defect that caused it to slip whenever the nursery's temperature varied by more than 2 degrees. On the second fix, she recognized the defect. It was the same thermal expansion flaw she had identified in Pylon 9's gimbal housing aboard the ascending veil. The same alloy, the same fabrication line, the same failure mode. The projector was a toy-sized version of the problem Commander Vithais had blamed her for. She drew a diagram for Talvin on her reference slate explaining the physics in simple terms. The metal gets warm, warm metal gets bigger. The expansion shifts the lens and the stars drift. It is not the lens's fault, she said. It is the housing that holds it. The housing does not account for what heat does. Talvin studied the diagram for a long time. Then he disappeared around the sleeping platform and returned with a fragment of crystalline material from his building set, a piece he had broken off weeks earlier and kept in his pocket because, he said, it was the right shape for something I had not found yet. It was, in fact, exactly the right shape. Dara fitted the crystal fragment into the lens housing as a thermal shim, a non-expanding spacer that held the lens in position regardless of temperature change, and the projector never slipped again. Talvin had solved his own problem. All he had needed was someone who explained the problem in a way he could hear. Day 7. His shoes. The fastening mechanism on Prince Talvin's shoes was a velour magnetic clasp, an elegant flush-mounted system designed for adult motor function. Activating it required a precise grip and twist motion with enough pressure to overcome the clasp's magnetic detent, a motion well within the capacity of an adult velour hand, but beyond what a 4-year-old's fingers could generate. Every morning, a nanny fastened his shoes. Every evening, a nanny removed them. He had never fastened his own shoes. He had never been given a way to. He did not ask Dara to fix his shoes. He placed them on the floor in front of her, sat down across from them, and waited. She looked at the clasp, thought about it for 20 seconds. Then she took a thin strip from her gray cloth, looped it through the clasp's activation tab, and tied it into a pull ring, a small fabric loop that a 4-year-old's grip could manage. The ring translated the pull force into the rotation the clasp needed, the same principle as a lever arm. Simple mechanics. The kind of thing a navigation specialist learned in the first week of training. Talvin put on his shoes and activated the clasp himself. He stared down at his feet. Then he looked up at Dara, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen on a child before. A fierce, trembling pride, the look of a person who has just done the thing that everyone else did for him by himself for the first time. It was the same expression she had seen on junior technicians, the first time they completed a solo calibration, and the numbers came back clean. "Show me again," he said. "I want to do the other one." She showed him. He did the other one. He walked 3 laps around the nursery in his self-fastened shoes, each lap faster than the last, his white-silver hair bouncing, his small feet landing with a deliberateness that said he was feeling the ground through the soles and knowing, for the first time, that the contact between him and the floor was his own doing. On the 3rd lap he detoured past Dara and touched her shoulder briefly with one small hand, not clinging, not asking, just acknowledging the way a colleague touches your shoulder after a successful repair, and kept walking. On the 4th lap he stopped at the door, looked out into the empty corridor where the mop bucket waited, looked back at Dara and said, "When I can walk by myself, I will come find you." It was not a declaration. It was a plan, stated with the same flat precision he applied to constellations and projector lenses. Dara nodded and said, "I will be in the corridor," and meant it in every sense the words could carry. Day 9. He was waiting at the door when she arrived, the mechanical bird in one hand and 4 other toys arranged in a precise line on the floor behind him. The 6-legged plush creature, a miniature transport with a stiff hatch, a music sphere with a cracked resonator, a glow tile puzzle with 2 tiles that did not sit flush. "These need you," he said. She fixed them all, one by one, while Talvin sat beside her and offered observations that were more technically precise than anything in the developmental specialist's reports. The music sphere's resonator was not cracked. He told her it was Mies-tuned, producing a harmonic that clashed with the nursery's ambient frequency profile. He was right. She reseated the resonator, and the sphere's tone shifted to a key that made him close his eyes and breathe deeply for the first time all session. Day 11. There is a new wrong sound behind the wall. Dara pulled the toy shelf away from the wall and found the source. A pipe joint behind the mounting bracket had developed a slow seep, not enough to drip, but enough to produce a faint, intermittent ticking as the moisture condensed and fell. She sealed it with a compression shim from the maintenance supply locker on deck 14, a locker she had access to, because mopping auxiliaries were trusted with basic supplies. Talvin stood behind her and watched the repair. "You hear them too," he said. It was not a question. Day 13. The ceiling grate whistled during station rotation. A floor panel near the door clicked during thermal cycling. She baffled the grate with folded cloth and shimmed the panel. Each fix was small. Each removed a sound that no adult had ever registered and that Talvin heard every minute of every day. Day 14. He took her hand when she sat down and did not let go for the entire 40 minutes. When she worked on repairs, he shifted his grip to her wrist or forearm, maintaining physical contact at all times. He was not clinging. He was anchoring the same way Dara had anchored herself to the Bridger's calibration console during deep space transits when the silence outside the hull became too large to hold alone. Day 15. One of the developmental specialists, a Valori woman named Physician Catherine, tall and precise, with the clinical manner of someone who had spent decades in institutions, arrived for a scheduled follow-up assessment. Dara was not in the nursery at the time. She was in the corridor mopping, and she heard the assessment through the open comms channel. Physician Catherine spoke to Talvin in the standard developmental assessment voice, bright, elevated, slightly too loud, addressing him as though he were a system to be diagnosed rather than a person to be heard. She sat in a chair not on the floor. She positioned herself above him, looking down, and asked him to identify shapes on a portable display unit. She asked him to respond to verbal prompts delivered at a volume and tempo calibrated to adult conversational norms. She asked him to demonstrate fine motor coordination using the magnetic clasps on a standardized test garment, the same magnetic clasps that Dara had bypassed with a cloth pull ring, because they were designed for adult hands and excluded him from basic autonomy. Talvin did not respond to any of it. He sat on the floor holding the mechanical bird and said nothing. He did not look at the display. He did not reach for the test garment. He sat with his shoulders drawn up and his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and Dara recognized the posture from her own experience. It was the posture of a person enduring an environment they cannot escape, not defiance, not withdrawal, endurance. The assessment lasted 22 minutes. Physician Catherine gathered her equipment, spoke briefly with Nanny Tessith at the door, and departed. She filed her report within the hour. Patient remains nonverbal and non-responsive to structured developmental prompts. No significant behavioral change observed since prior assessment. Motor function untested due to noncompliance. Recommend continued monitoring with possible escalation to off-station neurological evaluation. Dara read the report that evening through the environmental panel access, the same access that let her monitor the nursery's lighting, ventilation, and acoustic profile. She read it twice. Noncompliance. The word sat in her chest like a stone. The prince had not been noncompliant. He had been subjected to a 22-minute barrage of frequencies, volumes, and social demands that were designed for an adult and delivered from above him by a stranger. And he had survived it by going silent, which was the only coping mechanism the room's design left him. She closed the panel and went back to mopping, and her jaw was tight, and she said nothing to anyone, because there was no reporting path from a mopping auxiliary to the clinical oversight board. And even if there had been, she would have been filing a complaint about a credentialed specialist based on observations made without authorization from a corridor she was supposed to be cleaning. The next day, when she entered the nursery, Talvin was sitting in the center of the room with the bird's wing removed and placed on the floor in front of him. He had taken it off himself. "It was making the sound again," he said. Dara sat down and fixed it, and then he told her something he had not told anyone, that the assessment visits made the room wrong for hours afterward. The specialist's voice lingered in the walls, he said. The vowels were sharp and they bounced off the hard surfaces, and they did not leave. They stacked on top of the ventilation hum and the lighting shift and the other sounds, and by the time the room was quiet again, hours had passed, and he was too tired to speak to the nanny who arrived next. "That is why I stopped talking," he said. "Not because I could not, because talking made more sound and there was already too much." Dara set the caliper down. She looked at the small prince with his broken bird and his precise, devastating analysis of his own silence, and she understood something that 3 specialists and 7 nannies and a commander and an empress had not, that the child had not withdrawn from language. He had withdrawn into the only quiet he could find, which was his own silence. The withdrawal was not the pathology. The withdrawal was the treatment. Day 16, a drawing, 2 figures on a floor, the tall one holding a caliper, the small one smiling. That is us. Day 18, when you leave, the room gets loud, not the sounds you fixed, new ones, the pipes in the wall behind the shelf, the floor panel near the door that clicks when the temperature changes, the air from the ceiling grate, it has a whistle in it when the station turns. You hear all of those. "I hear everything," Talvin said, and there was no pride in it and no complaint, just fact. The fact of a child who could not turn the volume down on a world that was always, relentlessly, too loud, and who had been told by every specialist who entered his room that the excess volume was his problem. She came back after her shift that evening with a pouch of shims and seals she had fabricated in the maintenance shop from standard issue materials that a mopping auxiliary was authorized to requisition. She sealed the pipe joint behind the shelf, the same one she had fixed on day 11, which had developed a secondary seep at an adjacent fitting. She shimmed the clicking floor panel with a thin wafer of composite wedged beneath the panel's thermal expansion gap. She fitted a cloth baffle into the ceiling grate's outlet vanes, killing the whistle without restricting airflow. Each fix took minutes. Each removed a sound that no adult on the station had ever perceived. Each one, to Talvin, was the difference between a room he could live in and a room that was slowly grinding him down. Day 19. He sat in the center of the nursery with his eyes closed and the bird in his lap and smiled. It was the first time Dara had seen him smile without prompting, not the response to a fixed toy or a solved problem, but a smile that arose from the simple fact of being comfortable in the place where he lived. "It is quiet," he said, without opening his eyes. "Good quiet or bad quiet?" "The first kind." Day 20, a bad day. The ventilation system had been reconfigured for a station-wide atmospheric purge routine maintenance that increased throughput to 140% for 6 hours. The subsonic hum rose from 18 Hz to 23, and Talvin was curled on the floor when Dara arrived, not crying but vibrating with a tension so deep it was silent. She overrode the nursery's ventilation governor to decouple it from the station-wide purge, dropping the hum back to tolerable levels. It took her 9 minutes. During those 9 minutes, Talvin kept his hands over his ears and his eyes squeezed shut, and when the hum dropped, he exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for all 9 of them. "You came," he said, and his voice was raw and his hands were shaking. "I always come," Dara said. She sat down beside him on the floor and did not touch him, because she knew from 14 days of observation that he needed to initiate contact on his own terms. After 30 seconds, he reached for her wrist and held it. "Promise," he said. She looked at him. She was a mopping auxiliary earning minimum subsistence credits, with no authorization to be in this room, no professional standing, and no guarantee that tomorrow's shift would not be her last. She had no contract, no credential the ascendancy recognized, and no power to protect even her own assignment, let alone a promise to a prince. Commander Vithais could transfer her to a different deck with a single notation. A protocol review could bar her from Deck 14 entirely. She had no business making promises she could not guarantee keeping. But she had spent 4 years on the bridger keeping a ship on course that nobody thanked her for, and 63 days mopping floors that nobody noticed, and 20 days fixing sounds that nobody heard. And the one constant across all of it was that Dara Khas did the work whether or not anyone saw her do it. "I promise," she said. He exhaled. His grip on her wrist loosened. He leaned into her side, not collapsing, just resting, the way a structure rests against a buttress when the wind drops. Day 21, Nanny Saratai came around the corner. She found the mop bucket outside the door open, and inside, the mopping auxiliary sitting cross-legged on the floor with the second heir to the Velori ascendancy in her lap, both looking at the star map projector and talking about constellations. Talvin heard her breathing and looked up. "Dara is staying," he said clearly. Saratai left. Within the hour, Dara was summoned to Commander Vithais's office on Deck 3. The summons came through the maintenance dispatch system, a terse automated message on the corridor's wall panel. "COSSC D Auxiliary. Report Deck 3 Administrative. Immediate." She read it, set the mop in the bucket, wiped her hands on the gray cloth and walked to the lift junction at frame 19. The lift took her from the residential wing to the administrative level, a transition she had never made in 63 days of service. Deck 3 was different from Deck 14. The way a command bridge was different from an engine room, the same station, the same hull, but the air had a different density, and the people in the corridors wore pressed uniforms and carried themselves with the assumption that they would be seen. Nobody on Deck 3 was invisible. The hierarchy did not permit it. Dara walked past a Velori adjutant who glanced at her gray uniform, then through her, filing her in the same mental category as the wall panel and the overhead lighting. Infrastructure, not person. She found the administrative suite and entered. The office was large, Velori-scaled, with a panoramic viewport overlooking the station's external shipyard, where frigates drifted in their maintenance cradles. Through the glass, Dara could see the ascending Veil, the same ship she had calibrated 63 days ago, the same Pylon 9 that had drifted 6 arcseconds after her correction was overwritten by a system that did not account for a defect she had documented and nobody had read. Vithais was standing behind his desk with his hands clasped at the small of his back. His pale blue skin was drawn tight across his jaw, the expression of an officer who has been told that a problem he considered closed has been reopened by someone who should not have had the access to reopen it. Beside him, standing at the viewport's edge with her arms folded, was physician Catherine, the developmental specialist, the one whose assessment Dara had read through the environmental panel. She regarded Dara with the cool, calibrated attention of someone who has already formed a diagnosis and does not expect revision. "You entered the royal nursery without authorization," Vithais said. "Yes, sir." "You altered environmental controls in a restricted space without clearance." Yes, sir. For 21 days. Yes, sir. And you have been interacting with the prince in a manner that contradicts the developmental protocol established by the Central Institute. This was Catherine, her voice precise and level. The prince's care plan specifies structured verbal engagement, sensory enrichment, and guided social response training. You have been doing none of these things. No, Dara said. I have been doing the opposite. Catherine's eyebrows rose by a fraction. Explain. The prince's care plan is calibrated to adult Valori perceptual baselines. His perceptual baselines are not adult. He hears frequencies below 18 Hz. He registers lighting temperature shifts as environmental ruptures. He processes staffing transitions as social discontinuities. Every element of the current care protocol, the bright verbal engagement, the sensory enrichment, the guided social prompts, adds noise to a room that is already intolerably loud. The prince is not nonverbal. He is in acoustic overload. He stopped talking because talking adds more sound, and there was already too much. Catherine's expression tightened. You have no clinical training. No, I have calibration training. I read frequencies. I identify failure modes. The prince's failure mode is the same as Pylon 9's, a system designed for one set of tolerances being operated under a different set, and nobody checking whether the tolerances match. That is a machinery analogy applied to a child. It is an observation applied to an environment. The child is fine. The environment is wrong. Silence fell. Vithais looked at his display, where the deviation report was still open, 63 days old, the math terse and correct. Catherine looked at Dara's hands, which were calloused and still and held no authority at all. The prince spoke to you, Vithais said again, as though the fact required repetition to become real. He speaks to me every day. He identified the manufacturing defect in his star map projector, the same thermal expansion flaw documented in my deviation report for Pylon 9, same fabrication line, same alloy. He diagnosed the rotational error in his ceiling mural by comparing it to an astrometric survey his nanny read to him 6 months ago. He described the acoustic profile of his nursery with more precision than any environmental report filed on this station. He is not developmentally delayed. He is perceptually advanced, and his environment has been punishing him for it. Catherine opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. She turned to the viewport and was quiet for several seconds. I reviewed the nursery's environmental logs this morning, she said, and her tone had changed. After Nanny Saratai filed her observation, the modifications you made, the lighting override, the ventilation reduction, the acoustic baffling, they correlate with every improvement in the prince's behavioral metrics over the past 3 weeks. Sleep duration, distress frequency, vocalization count. Yes. The correlation is not subtle. No. Another silence. Vithais studied Dara with an expression she recognized, the look of a person confronting the gap between what should have been done and what was done, and measuring the distance. What do you recommend? He asked. A full environmental audit of the nursery, calibrated to the prince's sensory profile rather than Valori adult baselines. Replacement of all magnetic clasps on his clothing and footwear with manual fasteners. He can operate independently. Discontinuation of the current developmental assessment protocol, which is producing anxiety without diagnostic value. Reduction of staff rotation from 6-day cycles to 30-day minimum to provide continuity. And a consistent, single-point caretaker who communicates at his processing level, follows his lead, and does not treat his silence as a deficit. You are describing yourself. I am describing what the data supports. If someone else is better suited, I will return to mopping. Physician Catherine turned from the viewport. I would like to observe your next session with the prince, she said. Not to interfere, to observe. Dara looked at her. He will know you are there. He hears everything. If your observation adds a wrong sound to the room, he will withdraw. Then I will be quiet. Vithai stood. Wait outside, he said, both of you. Dara and Catherine stood in the corridor together for 18 minutes. They did not speak. Catherine looked at Dara's caliper, visible in her hip pocket, and said nothing. Dara looked at the viewport at the end of the corridor, where the stars outside the station moved in patterns she could calculate in her sleep, and said nothing. When the door opened again, it was not Vithai's or Catherine's supervisor or a protocol officer. Empress Ethelly, Val Theron, stepped into the corridor. She was tall, ice pale, with luminous silver hair braided in a close crown, and a formal gray gown threaded with crystal filaments that threw tiny prisms of light across the walls. Her eyes were pale violet, the same shade as Talvin's, the shade Dara had seen brighten and dim with the child's emotional state for 21 days, and they were red-rimmed in a way that spoke not of hours but of months. Of a mother who had been told, repeatedly, by the finest specialists the ascendancy could produce, that her son was receding, and that the recession might not reverse. Her hands at her sides were trembling. "You are the woman who fixed my son's bird," the Empress said. "Yes, Your Grace." "And his projector, and his shoes, and the pipes behind his wall, and the whistle in his ceiling grate, and the sound in his room that no one else could hear." "Yes, and he speaks to you every day." The Empress studied Dara with the complete, unhurried attention of a woman who governed worlds, and had learned, in the last hour, that the answer to the question she had been asking for 6 months had been mopping the corridor outside her son's room. "I have read your deviation report," the Empress said. "Commander Vithais filed it without review 63 days ago. It is correct. The manufacturing defect affects 11 other systems aboard this station, all from the same fabrication line. He has ordered a full audit." Dara nodded. "I have also reviewed your environmental modifications and physician Ulith's assessment of your subsonic analysis. He described your findings as, I will quote him exactly, embarrassingly obvious in retrospect. Most solutions are, Your Grace." The Empress's expression changed. Not a smile. Something beneath a smile, the recognition of a mind that had been invisible and was now, against every expectation the hierarchy could produce, standing in a corridor in a wrinkled gray uniform, smelling of cleaning solution, and waiting to be told whether she could go back to mopping or back to the nursery. "Come with me," the Empress said. They walked to deck 14 in silence. Physician Catherine followed at a distance, saying nothing. The nursery door was open. Talvin was inside, sitting on the floor in the center of the room, the mechanical bird in his lap, the 6-legged creature beside him, the corrected star map projector throwing true constellations across the wall. The room was warm and quiet, warm white lighting, the ventilation hum below perception, no wrong sounds. When he saw Dara, his face changed. The careful, uncertain smile, the brightening of the cyan ring around his irises. When he saw his mother, he went still. He looked from the Empress to Dara and back again, reading the room the way Dara read calibration data, measuring the angles and distances and frequencies, assessing whether this new configuration was safe. The Empress knelt, not the controlled, formal descent of a sovereign before a subject. The unplanned, graceless drop of a mother who had run out of protocols and specialists and performance notes, and was trying the only approach she had not tried, being at the same level as her child, in the same quiet, without speaking first. Talvin waited. The Empress waited. The room held its breath. Then Talvin held up the mechanical bird. "Dara fixed it," he said, his voice clear and steady. "She fixes everything. She hears the wrong sounds." He paused. He looked at the Empress. He was calculating, the way he always calculated, not whether to speak, but whether the room could hold what he was about to say. "Can she stay?" he asked. The Empress's hand rose to her mouth. Her eyes closed. When they opened, The pale violet luminescence in them was bright with a recognition so deep it was almost grief, the expression of a mother hearing her child speak after 6 months of silence and understanding, in the same flooding instant, that the silence had never been emptiness. The silence had been a child waiting for someone who heard what he heard, who talked from the same place he was, who fixed the sounds that no one else could hear. And that person had been mopping the floor outside his door for 63 days, and nobody had seen her, because nobody sees the mopping auxiliary. Yes, the Empress said, and her voice broke on the word. She can stay. Talvin nodded, satisfied. Then he looked at his mother, who was still kneeling, and placed one small hand on her knee. You can stay too, he said, if you are quiet. The Empress let out a sound that was half laugh and half something older than laughter, and she stayed where she was, and the room held the three of them. Talvin looked at his mother. Then he looked at Dara. Then he looked at Physician Catherine in the doorway. He was reading them, all three of them, with the same careful precision he brought to constellations and hinge mechanisms, measuring whether the room could hold this many people without becoming loud again. It could, because none of them were performing. The Empress was kneeling. Catherine was standing still. Dara was waiting. The room was warm white, and the hum was gone, and the wrong sounds had been fixed. And for the first time since Dara had entered it 21 days ago, the nursery contained exactly what a 4-year-old needed. Adults who were present without filling the space, quiet without being absent, there without demanding that he prove he noticed. Talvin turned to Dara and held out the bird. The wing is making the sound again. Dara sat down on the floor. She pulled the caliper from her pocket, took the wing in her hands, and began to fix it. The pivot pin had loosened again, the same stress point, the same failure mode. She packed the joint, crimped the housing, and handed it back. 90 seconds. The same repair she had done on day 1 and day 2 and day 7 and today. The same small act, the same quiet competence, the same result, a sound that was wrong becoming a sound that was right. Talvin opened the wing, closed it, opened it, nodded. Then he turned to the Empress and said, in a voice that was small and steady and absolutely clear, "The third founding constellation in the ceiling mural is in the wrong position. It should be 1.4 degrees further aft. Dara showed me why. Do you want me to explain it to you?" The Empress looked at her son. She looked at Dara. She looked at the ceiling, where the constellations turned in their slow phosphorescent cycle, and one of them, the third from the left, was indeed in the wrong position, and her 4-year-old child had known this for weeks, and the woman who mopped the floor had been the one he told. "Yes," the Empress said, "I would like that very much." Talvin began to explain. His voice was quiet but precise, and the words came steadily, and Dara sat beside him with the caliper on her knee and listened to a child who had been silent for half a year talk about the stars, and she did not interrupt, and she did not correct him, and she did not need to. The constellations turned slowly on the ceiling above them, pointed true. Outside in the corridor, the mop stood cooling in its bucket. In Commander Vethal's office, a 63-day-old deviation report was open on the display, its math clean and correct and finally being read. And Physician Catherine stood in the nursery doorway, watching a mopping auxiliary repair a mechanical bird for a prince who was telling his mother, in a voice that had been silent for half a year, about the rotational period of the third founding constellation, and why the mural painter had gotten it wrong, and how Dara had fixed it. The Empress listened, the physician listened, Dara fixed the wing. And on the duty roster for Deck 14, Dara Kasa's name still appeared in the mopping column, though by morning it would be moved not to alignment, not to calibration, but to a position that had not existed until the Empress created it that afternoon. Nursery Environmental Specialist, reporting directly to the household authority, answering to no protocol committee, carrying no title grander than the one Talvin had already given her. The one who fixes everything. But that was tomorrow's designation. Tonight the wing needed fixing, and Dara's hands knew the way, and the room was warm and quiet, and a boy who had been silent was finally talking, and no one in the room said a single word more than was needed, and it was enough.